Who thinks this is the next natural step in business sustainability strategy? Wow, that's quite a bunch. That's good news. Be ready with your questions, everyone. Ian, you talked about a number of forest projects. I'm just trying to understand a bit more about how reforestation practically reduces your supply risk. And, you know, obviously reforestation, the rate of reforestation seems quite slow compared to the rate of logging. So if I imagine an investor will say, well, you're telling me this is going to reduce risk. How does it do it?
Well, I think it goes back to some of these points at the moment about you're sitting on various sort of unresolved risks at the moment in any business which, you know, could leave you exposed if things went the wrong way. And at the moment, the rate of expansion of certified wood supply is not fast enough to keep up with what looks like the demand. Therefore, it seems pretty blindingly obvious to us that that will lead to price pressure. We've calculated that, and hence the exposure. The challenge in reforestation is the point I mentioned about the time lag so the sooner you start in any form of reforestation, frankly, the better. But I think it also puts you into the preferred partner position if you know, again, selfishly in a competitive business, if I'm trying to minimize my risk, I'd like to be in the first in the queue for those sources of supply, you know, of certified timber. And I'm more likely to get that if I've been involved in generally helping create those sources. So now this is a multi-year. You don't show up and say, oh, thanks very much, I'll have a forest now, and that'll sort out next year's supply problem. It's a 5, 10, 15-year plan. But I think what is interesting is that there's a gap, because you've got people like Norwegian government and others who are putting funding into RED and other things. There are host governments who are quite interested, and the missing gap often is, well, how do I assure the market solution for this, and how do I find that third party? And I think that's where we're filling a potential gap, as well as trying to make sure we are genuinely building something that will grow over time. And I think if we do all that, I think we can generally say that we're managing that risk, and we are putting ourselves in better shape to have an expanded supply when it's going to come under pressure.
I mean, you're asked this all the time. You've got some huge long-term goals. How does this carry forward? I was going to say when you're gone, which sounds a bit final, but no, sorry. I mean, when you move on from the business.
Yeah, this is. I think there's a really interesting challenge in this, which is about it can't just be. I don't think any of this can be one person's picture, one person's vision. You do need top-level sponsorship and engagement, but unless it turns into an embedded culture and a way of doing business, then you change the person at the top and everything sort of falls apart. And I think there is a degree to which, you know, you've either got organisations that naturally work towards this and can be pushed and challenged, but I think the key thing is to recruit, you know, a movement inside and outside the business as soon as you can, because that will generate the momentum and it'll have a life beyond any one individual. And I think part of that is external stakeholders holding to us to account, which I think is great because that pushes it. But the second is I think really to try and drill all the way down into the organisation and find coalition of the willing that want to really see this happen. And I certainly, you know, I'm not planning to be around in 2050. I know that much. And so sometime between now and 2050, it'll be someone else's problem. But hopefully by then we will have created enough people who want to make this succeed.
And Tom, same question. I mean, you've had change at the top at Rio Tinto. So how embedded is this whole thing? It's not the question you wanted, is it?
Well, no, I was going to pick up very directly on that question, actually. The answer is I don't know. And the idea that you're going to measure that over one event, like a change of CEO, I think is a bit unrealistic. But I think there's a more positive way to look at this, certainly from a Rio Tinto perspective. What we did over the last 15 years was we really built a safety culture inside Rio Tinto. And a safety culture is more than KPIs, more than management systems, more than incentives. A safety culture is what you've got people in exposed situations saying to each other. And that's how you know you've built a culture, when it's not what's going up and down the line, but what's being said around. Well, what I think is really important is how do you take the lessons out of building a safety culture and say, how do we build an environment culture? How do we build a culture that can cope with social pressures and community tensions? Because if you look at the world and the pace of change over the next 10 years, you're not going to be able to screw up, as we did on safety, and learn the lesson and adjust systems. you're going to have to already have put in place a culture that can take with a very much more volatile, very much riskier world, where everybody in the culture responds to the same stimuli in the same way. And so I think that sort of core piece, it goes to really building the capacity of the company to be a good risk manager. And that's the message, and you were right about that, Ian, that we have got to get across to the investor community so they learn to distinguish between those companies which have done that and those which haven't.
And Tom, since you've had the ambition to be biodiversity positive, is there evidence that this has boosted the social license to operate for the company?
I don't think it would be that clear. I think that we're still at the point where we are now, we're rolling it out things, but probably only over the last 2 or 3 years that we've actually really been rolling it out as a sustained piece in those areas of high conservation value. You don't get to set up artificial tests of your social license to operate, and you can't run it in a model. And also, your social license to operate is challenges or threats to it are a result of multiple factors. And what you're trying to do by doing net positive impact, by being net positive, is minimize that risk. You can't remove that risk. And I think it would be too soon to claim that we'd actually could show here is a clear-cut case of where we actually, if we hadn't done net positive impact, we would have been exposed. I think that's too soon.
When this is proposed in a region, do governments ask for a guarantee on this? Do they want contractual arrangement to say you will leave a place in a better state than you found it in terms of biodiversity?
They've done that for they've done that for a long time in the sense of setting closure standards, which in many parts of the world there's no machinery or mechanism to insist on the closure standards. And so you're not under, as you might be, say, in North America or in Western Europe, where you might be actually under a sort of compliance pressure. It's very much got to come out of your desire to do what is right, but recognizing that you live in a world that's totally transparent. This is not a world in which there are any parapets you can hide behind. So even if the government doesn't hold you to account, you're going to be held to account by the broader society. And sometimes that produces collisions the other way, where the government would like you to move faster, would like you to generate revenues faster, and you know that's going to create real pressures, say, with your communities. And then, so it can sometimes be quite a tense dialogue.
Yeah. Can we just see, what are the questions out there? Okay, just hold that thought, please, Paul and others. Cordula, which came first, the ambition to save customers carbon or the delivery, the fact you realised products were doing this?
It's an interesting question, because actually I would say it has been a stepwise process. I mean, of course, many of the products I mentioned as our climate protection products, they have been in our portfolio for quite a number of years. It's not like we didn't start those product lines 5 years ago. So when we looked into how are we touched by this whole climate change issue, we actually realized that there are those products, they are already in our portfolio. So let's see how much good they do. And then by analyzing that in more detail, we realized we should do more. So some of the current R&D projects we are having right now, I think they were really sparked by doing this calculation and realizing that there is business opportunity out there, and we should go into this more deeply. So I think it's a bit like you already have a starting point, you look into that a bit more deeply, then you formulate your ambition. This gives new products, which again helps you move down that road a bit further.
And some of your products help to make more efficient vehicles. So there's clearly a net positive win there for the company. But if you go right down the value chain, I mean, the sheer growth in car sales and cars on the road sort of erodes those efficiency gains that you're making. So how do you draw the boundaries, and how do you steer products towards an ultimate net positive win?
This is a very interesting question, the question of what is in the end net positive, the whole question of the rebound effect. What happens if you enable customers, end users to consume less gasoline because you are producing lightweight materials for cars, but in the end that only makes them drive more kilometers. And honestly, I would say, I mean, this is nothing where we have an answer yet. This is something where I also would say it's a thing we have to discuss with society. It's nothing that we answer as industry, where we say, well, this is actually our solution to it. But we have to discuss with consumers what is it that they want. So this is really about the partnership thing again. Try to cope with that rebound effect.
For any of you three, I mean, there are skeptics out there. I'm not thinking about out there necessarily, but out there. I call them the net negatives, which is completely biased by me. But I suppose one of the things which you've sort of touched on and Doug touched on in the survey is that, well, this is about offsetting, really. It's about doing something better somewhere else. And so can one of you sort of address that one?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that. I think there is a danger of confusing them simply with net positive equals offset. I think you can take a much broader picture of this, which is, if I think about our community piece, I think this is us trying to work out how we, 80,000 individuals, have a positive impact on 1,000 communities. And I think that's got nothing to do with offset. That's about a picture of the broader requirement for your business to be a net contributor. And it's not good enough just to sort of get by. Equally, I would say, and we never sort of vote for an offset as sort of step one, and I know there are various people probably in the room who see them as the equivalent of papal indulgences and they're extremely evil and nasty. I think there is a role for it, but I think it's more about trying to think of the totality of your business model, the totality of your impact, and work out what elements you can pull, and within that there may be a role for offset, but actually, you know, if I think about the innovation agenda, I'm as interested in circular economy products that might unlock a whole new set of very, very different income streams and actually shift my model into something which is significantly away from where I am today. I just think you're going to need a whole series of actions here and a series of ideas about how you could act. And one part of that may be you do more than you take, and that's fine because you're generating the economic value add to be able to do that. Doesn't necessarily mean offset, it could mean a whole set of other things, but it's an ambition, I think, rather than a narrow definition.
Yeah. And we've structured that in relation to biodiversity. You assess. First thing you do is you assess what you've got, what you're starting with. You avoid things. We moved a location of a railway line to avoid a chimpanzee habitat, for instance. And you can do things to avoid damage. You can minimize the damage. Yeah. Nobody could begin to say you could eliminate all damage from mining, but you can then think about how you minimize. You can rehabilitate. The thing about a mining operation is it's not like an agricultural operation. You only use the land for a period of time. It may be quite a long period. Mostly it's not that long a period. So you can rehabilitate. And it's only then that you're thinking, when you've got to the end of that chain, that you're thinking about offsets. But the key thing for us about that is you don't decide yourself what constitutes a valid offset. You do that in partnership, and I said we work with IUCN to come up with a protocol for verification that what we've done is legitimate. Will it be perfect? Almost certainly not. But does it create a much more mature discussion and debate and dialogue which gets you better results? Yes, it does. Mm-hmm.
Right, let's take questions. What were their hands, please? Could we take Paul there on the left, on my left, and the one here? Actually, we'll take Paul for now.
Thank you, Dax. Paul Toyne. My question is for all three of you. Just to put into context, Tom, you talk about the desire to do what is right and the fact that net positive can help a business handle systemic risk. And I wonder, all three, do you have examples now where you've used net positive filters to actually assist your decision making in your investment strategies for your business? And that's actually led to you saying, no, we won't do this. We'll walk away from that because it won't lead us in the direction that we want to be in terms of being a net positive company. Because I think that's almost like the acid test in terms of the evidence of the leadership that you're trying to demonstrate.
Yeah. I'm not sure I can at this stage point to something we've positively turned down, because I think most of the things we would have turned down would have failed on a number of grounds. But if I give you maybe a different take on it, has it encouraged us to do some things we might not have done otherwise? Yes. So as a result, really, of the vision around energy and net positive, it's led us to be involved with the Green Deal in the UK in terms of actively trying to build a business around helping customers refurbish their homes to create a step on the way towards a net positive home. And I'm not sure we would have got there if we hadn't done the thinking and the view that said that's a key area. So when you stand back and say, right, I've decided it is timber, it is energy, it is environment, it is innovation, you then start looking for things. And that's the point at which I think we've started now to go from thinking to test exemplar projects to start now to say, okay, how do I start to scale these up? And so I think it's provoking a whole sets of investments and initiatives which we wouldn't have got to on, if you like, a traditional sort of just be slightly less bad sustainability view. And it's challenging our thinking to say, well, where could we go? But I'd hope most of the things that we would turn down would fail on multiple criteria anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's most of the time, of course, it's multiple criteria where it would fail, but certainly over the last years, a thinking has been developed within BASF where when it comes to new investments or M&A deals, you check, and basically it's thinking about would that be considered as net positive from a societal perspective. And then when you find there are large issues where you are quite sure that it would be net negative in the way you said before, of course you can think about whether there are ways to go around that issue, to find some countermeasures or whatever. But if you find there is no possibility to turn that net negative at least into a net zero, then that would be a deal breaker.
Yeah, two things. One, I'd already referred to one example. So you mine where the ore body is, and you don't have a lot of choice of that. And I'd be very hard to say this would ever be a decisive issue and a decision whether to invest in a mine. But as an operational level, that's happening all the time. It's happening now all the time. And the example I quoted, literally the MPV calculation said put the railway line and siding here, and the decision that will putting it there would mean we couldn't do net positive impact, meant we put it somewhere else at additional cost. That's a straightforward and clear example where that piece ends. But I think it's important to stress that wherever you've got a risk, you've got an opportunity. And it is the extent to which, as you build the way of thinking that lets you manage these risks well, it also tends to identify opportunities for you.
Could you put your hands up again just here, please? Can we take the two together, please?
Thank you. Jonathan Tilson from DEFRA. I wonder if the panel had any reflections on the wider take-up of this approach. I'm very conscious you are leaders in this field in differing ways. We here are interested, already convinced this is the future or heading in that direction, trying to do our bit. Presumably there are large swathes of business who at best are sort of mildly interested, at worst are perhaps skeptical or just completely unaware. You've spoken about influencing the supply chain, working on investors and so on. How do you see this rolling out more generally in the future, and what are the sort of key influences on people if it's going to be taken up more widely?
And the other question, please.
Jeremy Osborne from Ernst & Young. I wonder if the panel could share any insights from what your CFOs make of what you've been doing.
Who wants to tackle those ones?
Yeah, so I think the wider take-up, not mentioned something we're sort of launching tomorrow, which is courtesy of DEFRA, the Ecosystems Market Task Force report, which is an attempt to start to get business thinking about valuing nature correctly and starting to think about some of the impact issues. It's not got maybe the total breadth of net positive, because we're not getting into social areas, but it is about changing your business model and putting the correct value of nature at the heart of it, and what risks and opportunities does that create. Although we're a 1 year sort of time expired, we Cinderella-like expire tomorrow night, I think. We are working with BITC and the CBI to take the messages forward and to enroll people. And I think one of the things you are seeing with this movement is a much more collaborative mutual reinforcement. And I would also say one of the things that's really struck me is the degree to which governments at UK and European levels, and we're in with Commissioner Potocnik this week, really are looking for business leadership in this area to step up and make a difference. And so there is I think an audience in the work certainly I've done with business in the community, but also an audience in government looking for business leadership in this. And I think this is about people stepping up, and actually one definition of net positive is, have you actually done something positive yourself? You know, are you just sitting there waiting for this to be solved, or are you going to get up and do it? And on CFOs, once you explain it to them nicely, they're fine.
I have a slightly torn view, and it's a personal view, not necessarily a Rio Tinto view. I think, you know, in a way, you want to preserve the competitive advantage you think you're getting. On the other hand, if you want it really to well outrider, then, and you want companies to innovate systematically across the spectrum, at the end of the day, governments have to regulate, and they will, sooner or later. I think the idea somehow that deregulation is good for business is probably mostly articulated by businesses that aren't very successful. But in terms of CFOs, just interesting sort of example, Rio has set up a specific non-financial risk unit because of the awareness that this level of risk is becoming increasingly important, and you can't conflate it into the sort of risk management devices that are traditionally used by CFOs to evaluate risk. You do need to make sure you're looking at these sort of risks systematically, even if they don't easily drop into an NPV calculation.
More questions? The two there in the middle, please.
Anna Simpson, Green Futures magazine. My question's for, sorry, could you hear me? My question's for Ian, but I'm very interested in what the other panelists have to say. Ian, you mentioned that you're asking what you can do for communities, and I was just wondering, what do you think communities would like from business?
And pass the mic, Anna.
Hi, Simon Abrams from Ernst & Young. Just a question about, we've been talking about long-term and making long-term decisions. What needs to happen to create space for chief executives and leaders to drive long-term decisions? And I'm thinking very much about the pressures for quarterly reporting, short-term tactical decision-making versus long-term real value-adding decision-making.
Cordula, fancy one of those? Space for long-term decision-making and whatever. Yeah.
This certainly is one of the most difficult things if we want to move in that direction of long-term net positive. But I think the way you explained it, Ian, and I think this is also the way we move in BASF, we have something like a long-term vision, which in our case is the purpose. We create chemistry for a sustainable future. And this is what convinces the CFO, the business part of it. And then to break it down to the midterm and even short-term goals, to really operationalize it. And if that fits together, if the short-term and midterm goals, if they are part of that long-term vision, this is, in my eyes, how it works. I mean, anyway, you sort of have to reconcile those long-term vision and the short-term goals, because you'll only reach that long-term vision if you really work on it step by step. So in the end, it really comes down to convincing the people within your organization that what they do in their everyday activities, that this pays into the long-term goals, and to make them understand how their small part, what they are playing in the organization, how that feeds into the whole goal.
Can I just pick up on the communities point? I think the answer is communities want lots of different things. I think if I could tweak the question to what do they want from us, we've defined our purpose as better homes, better lives, because actually what people want is to make their homes better, and in order to make their lives better, it's the most important thing in their entire life. That's the heart of their ambitions, and our job is to help them do that and do it better. And the interesting thing about the community aspect is, yes, they want us to provide jobs and do the various other things, but what we've seen in things like DIY classes and Street Club is this huge desire to learn and connect. And I think we've found that we've got something around the learning and connecting agenda, getting us from kids in building bird boxes through to finally desperate wife whose husband's not done anything around the house for the last 10 years, finally learning how to change a tap, which is a revelation. And I think there are just this huge amount of space for companies to work out what's their contribution, and that wouldn't be true for someone in a different space. But for us, I think listening to them, that's taught us a lot. And to try and briefly answer, basically CEOs, there shouldn't be massive amounts of pity for CEOs. I mean, we get paid an enormous amount of money and do a great job in terms of enjoying our job. I think we have to do both the long term and the short term. It comes with the territory. If you try and do everything for the short term, you won't have a long term, vice versa. If you're just worried about long term, you're not trading it. So I think if you're going to want to operate at those sorts of levels, you've got to really ask yourself, I need to do both. But the key to pick up on that point is I think you have to have a structure. You have to have a narrative that explains to people what you're trying to do. So you give them a context that says, I'm doing this today because actually I'm driving towards these longer term objectives. Because if you simply say, I've done this slightly batty thing over here, and everyone goes, well, thanks very much, what's that about? People will begin to wonder whether you're actually running the business as well. If you go back to saying, I'm doing timber because it's a third of my product, and I want to be around in 40 years, you get a very different response. So I think it's about framing the right sort of context and then spending a lot of time communicating. But you do need to do both. You can't just do one or the other.
There's a question at the back. Is there one or two there? Just one. Okay.
Hi, Richard Tarberton from BT. It's a question predominantly for Kingfisher and for Ian. It's great to hear the leadership and the ambition being expressed in the net positive strategy of Kingfisher. And I think the conversation is moving in the right direction towards looking at the business case. In the context of that ambition and sharing the communication, where I've seen real success is where the NPV is aligned 100% with that ambition, where the business case has been created successfully to make it a sustainable business venture, not something which the business is doing because it's a nice to have. And my question is, who are you seeing as the key people who you would want to hold accountable for creating that business case? And what are the key challenges you're looking for them to address to make that business case successful? Thanks.
Great. Look, absolutely right. If it's not part of the business, then it won't ultimately get done. So you have to keep tying it to the business case. So when we launched Net Positive, we also took the top 200 of the organisation through the fact that their 4-year plan would then have to have a net positive 4-year plan as well, so that while we set out these broad themes, the different businesses can do them differently. So reforestation in Brico in Spain is about protecting the cork forests from fire or helping them regenerate after fire. Now that's fantastic. That won't work in, say, China. So what we've done is built a series of 4-year plans. They have to have NPVs attached to them, and there has to be a clear sense of why this is good for the business, as opposed to a little bit of lipstick on the bulldog. And from my point of view, that not all the companies and all the operations will get there that quickly. Some have got a lot more practice than others. But once you set the framework and you say, this is now part of how you do business, this is part of your 4-year plan, why haven't you got it? Then gradually I think people are beginning to understand that this is now just going to be embedded in your day job. And it's one of the reasons we get the challenge, you haven't got a sustainability officer on your main board. And my answer is, yes, you have, it's me. And you've got the rest of the line management as well. And if it's not part of the line management's worry set, then it won't get done.
More questions? There's 2 here at the front, please.
Hi, thanks. Martin Hunt from Forum for the Future. Some really positive stories here around strategies and so on. I think thinking about the scale of the challenge that we face, a lot of the pressures around the world, just phenomenal challenges ahead. The size of your organisations, you can definitely make an impact, even just through incremental improvement, given the size of your supply chains, the products and services you do. But I think there's also a case for the radical, the more disruptive innovation. And I just wondered if any of you would like to respond to that particular area and maybe highlight how you're going to try and nurture that, maybe internally within your own organisations or maybe externally with other partners. What are the success factors you're going to be looking for in that space? Because I think this is really going to need some disruptive innovation to change business models, products and services going forward.
Martin, pass the mic behind you.
Hi, David Short from GE. I just wondered, how do you find the net positive message works with other countries and cultures, and with your employees, I really mean? And do you find actually that it's a better way of communicating than old style strategies based on percentage reductions in bad things?
Okay, we need disruptive innovation, and how does net positive travel?
Net positive.
Net positive.
Let me answer on that net positive thing. In the very beginning, we had, when you introduced the survey, this question on whether people think that it's actually about offsetting. And I can talk about what happened when we first published the corporate carbon footprint 5 years ago. We actually had those two ways how we contribute to climate protection, and we sort of compared both to each other. And we said it's a 3-to-1 ratio, so 3 times more emissions avoided than emissions that are caused along the value chain. And actually, well, in the beginning, when we had that message, we thought it just helps people understand what we are talking about. But it actually turned out that some of our stakeholders thought it's about offsetting only, and that means you can increase your own emissions if you only also increase the avoided emissions, and you don't have to think about how you reduce your own emissions anymore. So this is why we now changed, and we are not talking about 3-to-1 anymore or any ratio, but say it's really about working on both aspects. So I really see the danger about this net positive, that people confuse it with, well, do in your own operations whatever you want, as long as you also have some nice business that helps in other areas. So this is something where I think we have to be careful in order not to lose the good ideas about net positive.
There are clearly differences in how a phrase like this plays in different cultures, but there are also different cultural attitudes towards driving. We've had to learn the hard way that you better get across those different cultural attitudes or you won't meet your safety targets. I think it's really important to recognize that the language may change, but the idea will translate into lots of different cultures. And it's enormously important that doing the right thing piece, the net positive is part of our attraction and retention for recruitment. And at the end of the day, large companies run on talent, people. You don't get any of the rest of it unless you have talented people. So that's really important. I don't know how you get companies to change their business models. If they're successful, particularly if it's a long-standing company, they're successful because they work. And so
an old story now, but Umicore you'll be aware of, a mining company based in Belgium, has abandoned below the ground mining, and they've gone into above the ground, what they call urban mining, recycling. Does not every extractive company need to at least partly diversify into that sort of...
No, but I'd be really interested to discover why they did that. And I'd be careful about the difference between the rhetoric and the reality. I think it's a question that lots of companies are going to have to face, because clearly not all the current business models that are very successful are compatible with the kind of future that we're going to have, whether, for instance, climate policy succeeds or fails. From Rio Tinto's point of view, a world in which climate policy fails is not one, say, a world that's 4 degrees warmer, is not one in which you're going to want to be sticking $20 billion into a hole in the ground in some country with suspect governance. So there's a sense in which one's got to accept that's a challenge. That in a sense, there are going to be big disruptions. And if companies don't think ahead about to business models, if companies don't think ahead about that, then there are going to be some very big shocks. But it's very, very hard to ask a company with a successful business model to change it. It took Microsoft to kill IBM's business model.
Can you wrap up, Ian, on this disruptive innovation question?
Yeah, and just one point about the other countries. Clearly, places like China and Russia start from very different sort of models of what they're worried about. But I do find that the core concept of net positive does resonate, because it's more about a sort of human-based view of the world than anything else. And I think what's important is to allow people to find different ways of expressing it. So you don't try and sort of force it in a one-size-fits-all. You say, look, here's the principles. Now, how does that work for you at this stage? And the answers in China will be different to the UK. I think radical disruptive technology, typically big companies are useless at this, and they have got very good at making the model ever better and ever more precise. But Microsoft largely missed, Google. Google will miss the next one. There will be a process. I think the two things you can do One is you have to have networks that bring you disruptive technology. So we're trying to do supplier innovation days where very young, funky companies are bringing stuff that we probably don't know what to do with, but at least we can start by it. And we've just had an example of LED lighting. It looks like they can cut our lighting costs by about 70% in the stores, completely out of left field. Fantastic. So we have to be open. And then the second thing is I think you have to have some concerted effort to do some visioning work on what your business might be like, which injects enough challenge to allow the people who are going to do the disruptive thinking. But on the whole, I have to say I'm a bit of a cynic on this. I would try and make sure I'm tracking the sort of 4 or 5 interesting disruptive companies and then buy them before they get too valuable.
Okay, on that note, we better wrap it up. Look, it's really over to you guys now, so do make sure your input really counts. We're going to write up this ideas menu, so that's coming your way in the next few weeks, so look out for that. A couple of points I need to say. There's an email coming round post-event to rate this event, so be nice. And then in April, you've got an evening with Sky's Jeremy Derrick, so that is the next Green Mondays event. I want to say an enormous thank you to Jim and the Green Mondays team. I've seen the huge amount of work that goes into pulling these events together, and it is astonishing. And Jim and Green Mondays, thank you for giving time and space to what I think is a very important and exciting agenda. And then finally, Ian is leaving us, unfortunately. Cordula is staying. Tom is leaving, unfortunately. But a huge thank you to Ian, Tom, and Cordula, please.